Hello once again from Providence's main hold. I do hope that you are all keeping warm, for 'tis right cold at our berth here in Alexandria. Indeed, the weather has turned, and it is now a bit chilly for skylarking in the rig or dancing hornpipes upon the forecastle. It is, however, the perfect weather for staying below decks when duty permits, with a book. Now, it is unfortunately the case that many sailors cannot read, and it therefore falls to those of us who have learned the art to read aloud to our less literary-minded shipmates. Generally, this involves deciphering letters from home or reading passages from religious texts. On rare occasions, however, a proper book will find its way before the mast, and we can all enjoy a bit of communal entertainment. Today is just such a day. I have here The Adventures of Roderick Ransom by Tobias Smollett. A very fine work of fiction, I am sure, and based upon the author's own experiences as a surgeon's mate aboard an English man-of-war. Today's reading finds our protagonist and narrator destitute and seeking employment. He is, unbeknownst to him, about to find it in the form of a Royal Navy press gang. I saw no recourse but the Army or Navy, between which I hesitated so long that I found myself reduced to a starving condition. My spirit began to accommodate itself to my beggarly fate, and I became so mean as to go down towards Wapping, with an intention to inquire for an old schoolfellow who, I understood, had got the command of a small coasting vessel then in the river, and implore his assistance. But my destiny prevented this abject piece of behavior, for as I crossed Tower Wharf, a squat, tawny fellow with a hanger by his side and a cudgel in his hand came up to me, calling, "Yo-ho, brother, you must come along with me." As I did not like his appearance, instead of answering his salutation, I quickened my pace in hope of ridding myself of his company, upon which he whistled aloud, and immediately another sailor appeared before me, who laid hold of me by the collar and began to drag me along. Not being in a humor to relish such treatment, I disengaged myself of the assailant, and with one blow of my cudgel, I laid him motionless upon the ground, and perceiving myself surrounded in a trice by 10 or a dozen more, exerted myself with such dexterity and success that some of my opponents were fain to attack me with drawn cutlasses. After an obstinate engagement in which I received a large wound on my head and another on my left cheek, I was disarmed, taken prisoner, and carried on board a pressing tender, where, after being pinioned like a malefactor, I was thrust down into the hold among a parcel of miserable wretches, the sight of whom well nigh distracted me. As the commanding officer had not humanity enough to order my wounds to be dressed, and I could not use my own hands, I desired one of my fellow captives, who was unfettered, to take a handkerchief out of my pocket and tie it round my head to stop the bleeding. He pulled out my handkerchief, 'tis true, but instead of applying it to the use for which I designed it, he went to the grating of the hatchway and, with astonishing composure, sold it before my face to a bumboat woman then on board for a quart of gin, with which he treated his companions, regardless of my circumstances and entreaties. I complained bitterly of this robbery to the midshipman on deck, telling him at the same time that unless my hurts were dressed, I should bleed to death. But compassion was a weakness of which no man could justly accuse this person, who, squirting a mouthful of dissolved tobacco upon me through the gratings, told me that I was a mutinous dog and that I might die and be damned for anything he cared. Finding there was no other remedy, I appealed to patience and laid up this usage in my memory to be called at a more fitting opportunity. In the meantime, loss of blood, vexation, and want of food contributed, with the noisome stench of the place, to throw me into a swoon, out of which I was recovered by a tweak of the nose administered by the tar who stood sentinel over us. This fellow at the same time regaled me with a draught of flip, and comforted me with hopes of being put on board of Thunder next day, where I should be freed of my handcuffs and cured of my wounds by the doctor. I no sooner heard him name the Thunder than I asked if he had belonged to that ship long, and he, giving me to understand that he had belonged to her for 5 years, I inquired if he knew Lieutenant Bolin. "No Lieutenant Bowling," he said, "odds my life and that I do, and as good a seaman he is as ever stepped upon a forecastle, and a brave fellow as ever cracked biscuit. None of your guinea pigs, nor your freshwater, wishy-washy, fair-weather fowls. Many a taut gale of wind have honest Tom Bowling and I weathered together. Here's his health with all my heart. Wherever he is, aloft or alow, in heaven or in hell, the lieutenant needs not be ashamed to show himself." I was so much affected by this eulogism that I could not refrain from telling him that I was Lieutenant Bowling's kinsman, in consequence of which connection he expressed his inclination to serve me, and when he was relieved, brought some cold-boiled beef on a platter, and biscuit, on which we supped plentifully, and afterwards drank another can of flip together. Next day, along with the other pressed men, I was put aboard the Thunder, lying at the Nore. When we came alongside, the mate who guarded us thither ordered my handcuffs to be taken off that I might get on board the easier. This circumstance being perceived by some of the company who stood upon the gangboards to see us enter, one of them called to Jack Ratlin, who was busied in doing this friendly office for me. "Hey, Jack, what Newcastle galley have you boarded in the river as you come along? Have we not thieves enough among us already?" Another, observing my wounds, which remained exposed to the air, told me my seams were uncocked, and that I must be new paid. A third, seeing my hair clotted together with blood, as it were into distinct cords, took notice that my bows were mended with the red ropes instead of my sides. A fourth asked me if I could not keep my yards square without iron braces, and in short, 1,000 witticisms of the same nature were passed upon me before I could get up the ship's side. After we had all been entered upon the ship's books, I inquired of one of my shipmates where the surgeon was, that I might have my wounds dressed, and had actually got as far as the middle deck, for our ship carried 80 guns, on my way to the cockpit, when I was met by the same midshipman who had used me so barbarously in the tender. He, seeing me free from my chains, asked with an insolent air who had released me. To this question I foolishly answered, with a countenance that too plainly declared the state of my thoughts, "Whoever did it, I am persuaded they did not consult you in the affair." I had no sooner uttered these words than he cried, "Damn you, you saucy son of a bitch, I'll teach you to talk so to your officer." So saying, he bestowed upon me several stripes with a supplejack he had in his hand, and, going to the commanding officer, made such a report of me that I was immediately put in irons by the master-at-arms, and a sentinel placed over me. Honest Ratlin, as soon as he heard of my condition, came to me and administered all the consolation he could, and then went to the surgeon on my behalf, who sent one of his mates to dress my wounds. This mate was none other than my old friend Thompson, with whom I had become acquainted at the Navy office as before mentioned. If I knew him at first sight, it was not so easy for him to recognize me, disfigured with blood and dirt, and altered by misery I had undergone. Unknown as I was to him, he surveyed me with looks of compassion, and handled my sores with great tenderness. When he had applied what he thought proper, he was about to leave me, and I asked him if my misfortunes had disguised me so much that he could not recollect my face. Upon this address he observed me with great earnestness for some time, and at length protested that he could not recollect one feature of my countenance. To keep him no longer in suspense, I told him my name, which, when he heard, he embraced me with affection, and professed his sorrow at seeing me in such a disagreeable situation. I made him acquainted with my story, and, when he heard how inhumanely I had been used in the tender, he left me abruptly, assuring me I should see him again soon. I had scarce time to wonder at this sudden departure, when the master-at-arms came to the place of my confinement, and bade me follow him to the quarter-deck, where I was examined by the first lieutenant, who commanded the ship in the absence of the captain, touching the treatment I had received in the tender from my friend the midshipman, who was present to confront me. Well, the transition to shipboard life is always hard on new hands, but young Ransom here seems to have had a particularly rough time of it. It is of no help that he has already made an enemy of a midshipman, a very junior officer to be sure, but an officer nonetheless. Next week, we shall see how our hero fares in his suit for justice to the first lieutenant. He has been hard used, 'tis true, but it is a rare thing indeed for a lieutenant to take the side of a newly pressed hand against that of a brother officer. Until next week then, shipmates, I must bid you all adieu.